So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be here in person, actually. It's interesting, it's just the hashgacha of things that I was supposed to meet. I'm not sure if it was supposed to be in person or by Zoom, the last one, and then it just happened to be it was a direct conflict, so I wasn't able to meet then. But the real hashgacha is not only when we able to meet in person, but now I have my book. The first time when we met like 3 months ago was before my book came out. So I'm very happy to be able to bring it here and share this with everyone. So first of all, maybe I'll just give a quick background. So I write in my book. The book is called Pain is a Reality, Suffering is a Choice. Okay, that's the title of the book. It's a provocative title. I find most people appreciate the title. One person gave me very strong negative feedback on the title, but almost everyone really understands the message of it and feels it's a good message. I think a very healthy message. So I write in the book that this book began. I know the exact date when the book began. I write in the book in my preface, began over 30 years ago on Tuesday, January 9th, 1990. So what happened on that fateful day? So my wife and I were living in San Francisco at the time. We'd moved there from Neve Yaakov, quite a transition, and I was working for a day school, a very unusual day school. It was doing also courses for doctors and lawyers all throughout the Bay Area. They had an institute called Institute for Jewish Legal Ethics and the Institute for Jewish Medical Ethics. Amazing organization, doing courses for doctors and lawyers all over the place. So that was my main job. But once I was there, I also wanted to do courses in Judaism. Whoever was available, whoever wanted to come, and so on Tuesday nights, and this is totally separate from my job. Tuesday nights it was available in my house. People could come and sit in on whatever the course happened to be. So after doing a number of different topics, I decided to do a series, so the first part of the series is a 2-part series. It was called, let's do the exact title. It was called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Okay? And part 1 was called An Intellectual Perspective, and part 2 was called Dealing with It Emotionally. So part 1 happened. That was on the 2nd of the month, and on the 9th, that Tuesday afternoon, before my Tuesday night class, which had been scheduled, that's when we got the news that our daughter had leukemia. So, aside from the trauma and the overwhelming fright and so much was going on in our lives, but the juxtaposition was so striking. Thank you very much. The class which I didn't give that night, but I prepared to give, was dealing with difficulties emotionally. So it was very striking, and my Rosh Yeshiva called me, Rav Noach Weinberg Zatzal, he called me. I was in the hospital, I took the call, and I suggested to him perhaps there was something wrong with having prepared to teach this topic. Because at that time in my life, I was pretty young, everything was relatively good in my life. So what did I really know about trauma and difficulties and challenges on a real personal level? So maybe it was wrong to teach that topic. So he reprimanded me for that. He said, no, you're just definitely not wrong. And he basically told me the Jewish perspective has to be taught. People need to get this information. But then I thought about it more, and I've thought about this much over the years. So why did it happen? What was the message of the juxtaposition of the trauma? So on a simple level, one could say, before the biggest trauma of my life, I at least had more familiarity with Jewish sources on dealing with trauma. But the other thing I really got, and this I've only thought more and more about over the years, was I felt a very strong imperative to share these ideas. As much as I prepared to teach that class, obviously in the last over 30 years, I've expanded my knowledge of that topic enormously more. So what happened then, our daughter was treated and everything seemed to go smoothly, and we moved to New York, and she was being treated there, and then we moved back to Israel, and everything was in good, she was in remission, and then at the age, just before her bat mitzvah, she had a remission, very tragically, and then we had 3 very, very intense years. The beginning was in Neve Yaakov, the last part was in Beit Shemesh, and she passed away at the age of 14. So what I basically have done since that point is on her yahrzeit, I speak about these issues, and I research issues beforehand to speak about them. So, in fact, every chapter in the book is actually what I spoke about that particular year in the exact order of the years. And a person looks at the table of contents, you can see the journey that I myself went through grappling with these topics. Like the first beginning was talking about keeping a relationship with people who passed away. That was the first year, and then living with the loss, and then insights into Avelus from the Gemara, and then how do we maintain simcha, and then how do we deal with a life that's tragically cut short, and then how about painful emotions and anger of God, and these are all the things. Now, there are 2 things that I want to mention, I think, that make the book distinctive, which are very important, I think, for you to be aware of. First of all, it's my journey, my family's journey throughout these years. But second of all, it's coming from Jewish sources. I think there's over 600 classical Jewish sources in this book. So it's really not any one person talking, it's Judaism speaking. It's Reb Dessler, it's the Maharal, it's a Gemara, it's a Medrash. It's all classical sources. And so even for an educator, it's a fantastic resource, because most people aren't so familiar with lots and lots of sources about the nature of Olam Haba, about Gilgulim, about emotional, what's it mean to be angry with God, and like all these different things. So they're all gathered there, and it's all sourced. But I do want to say one thing, a very important point, that I look at this as much more than a grief book, even though it definitely is dealing with grief, but I really feel it's dealing with challenge and difficulty. And that makes it a universal book, because there's no person who doesn't have challenge and difficulty in their life. And in whatever areas, I guess I get the sense that each one of you is like a specialist in some area of challenge, whether it's divorce or whether it's disability or whatever it happens to be. In whatever area it is, we all have challenges in our lives. And as Jews, we like to know, what does Judaism tell us about that? And the other thing I want to mention is I feel it's a very uplifting book. It's not a sad book at all. It's a very uplifting and inspiring book, because the Jewish sources are very uplifting and inspiring. In fact, there's one chapter in here I call The Benefits of Difficulties. And I remember when I researched that one, I was preparing that one during the year to speak about it on the yahrzeit, I didn't even tell anyone what the topic was, because I thought people would react very negatively, because people would feel it's a very insensitive topic. And people rarely speak about benefits of Yisurim. People talk about, I coped with it, I dealt with it, I got through it. But people very rarely talk about benefits. But remarkably, that's the first thing that Jewish sources talk about. Why? Because obviously that's our perspective. God runs the world, God cares about us, and it's all for our benefit. So from a Jewish perspective, it's an obvious point, and from a non-Torah-based perspective, it's a shock. I want to mention the title, because the title is very provocative, and I think it's very important that people understand the title. And I think this is particularly important for the work that everyone here in this room does. So there's one particular verse which I quote extensively throughout the book. I don't know exactly how many times, but many times throughout the book. And this is the verse which I think best captures the Torah perspective on challenges and difficulties. It's a pasuk in Devarim, chapter 8, verse 5. So it says the following: V'yadata im levavecha. You should know with your heart. Ki ka'asher yaser ish espano. Just like a parent gives Yisurim to his child, his or her child, Hashem Elokecha mi'asraka. God your Lord gives you Yisurim. should know with your heart that just like a parent gives Yisurim to his child, also God your Lord gives you Yisurim. So I tell people, I think the most common translation of the word Yisurim is suffering. But you see, it's impossible that could be the translation based on the pasuk, because no one would translate that verse. You should know with your heart, just like a parent causes his child to suffer, so God your Lord causes you to suffer. By comparing God to a parent, obviously the Torah is telling us whatever is happening from God's love for our benefit. That's a simple understanding of what it is. So what are Yisurim from a Torah perspective? It's pain, but it's pain with purpose. That's what Yisurim are, pain with purpose. What would pain look like if there were no purpose associated with it? That would be suffering. Pain without purpose would be awful. That would be suffering. So therefore, often the situations in our life, we can't control the pain. Sometimes we could, but sometimes not. Like in our case, for example, when it comes to illness striking the family, it was nothing we could have done to prevent it. So the pain was a reality, but how we looked at it, how we dealt with it, how we related to it, that was a choice. So it seems to me that is such a critical point. Again, I'm not anywhere necessarily knowledge. I got a BA in psychology, but that doesn't mean I know very much about it. So I defer to everyone in the room. But it seems to me that, especially in today's world, where there's such a thought of that we're just victims and we have no choice. We're just helpless victims and we can't make any choices at all. In today's world, particularly, the message that we can make choices is so critical. So there's choices that we ourselves, my wife and I, and our family made during the illness, and that was a very hard time. And my wife basically lived in the hospital for months at a time. It was very hard for her, for me, for my family. It was very, very challenging. But then there was the choice we had when unfortunately our partner passed away. Are you going to continue to mourn your entire life and never ever get out of that mode, or will you at some point say, okay, we mourned, but now we have to move on and we have to continue our lives. You never forget it. Someone told me during the Shiva, someone compared the loss of a child to an amputation, which I think is a very appropriate, very striking, a very appropriate metaphor. A person who, God forbid, has an amputated limb, they can still have a good quality of life. It's a different life. You'll never, ever get to a point where you'll feel the limb is back. You know that's your reality. So that is a loss. But doesn't mean you can't enjoy life, you can't smile, you can't laugh. You can live a life, but you'll always have that loss. So I imagine some of the things that you help people with are issues which you can hopefully help them with and they can get past. But then some of them are ongoing traumas that there's no issue of getting past it. It's a question of how do you live with it? How do you deal with it? So then that's a choice. That's a massive choice. And so that's a really important statement about the title itself. Now, it's interesting, when I was originally planning to come here to speak, I was really planning to come and speak about my website. But this really comes from my website. My website is called jewishclarity.com, and it's really every chapter in this book is an article from the website. It's much more polished, that's true, but it's the same basic material on the website. So I really feel strongly this is a fantastic resource to be aware of yourselves, and it's a fantastic resource to recommend to the people you work with. And now that I have a book, so now even more so, I feel this is a very good resource, a very important resource. As you were saying, it's a Jewish source, and this is like it's hundreds and hundreds of Jewish sources to know about these important topics.
So I just had a question. You were talking about people being resentful after a big loss like that. And I wanted to know if you've ever gotten the question as a rabbi, because I've talked about it as a therapist, but as a rabbi, how is it okay for me to ever be happy after what happened? How am I dishonoring the person who I lost? Am I dishonoring the people, let's say people who went through like that building collapse in Florida, am I dishonoring all the people who were in that collapse? So I wanted to hear it from like a rabbinic place, how that was dealt with.
Such a good question, such an important
It's a
question.
question that people ask.
Yeah, for sure. It's such an important question. Yeah. So, So, first of all, I'll tell you something that I mentioned this in the book. This was almost the our Shiva began, my daughter passed away on Shabbos. So our Shiva began Motzei Shabbos and it really ended on Shabbos morning, but sitting Shiva ended Erev Shabbos. Almost the very, very end, almost before Shabbos came in, like almost the last thing we heard before Shabbos, we got a phone call from a teacher of my wife, I think it's Rabbi Karlinsky, who's a teacher of my wife's, and she said something which really resonated with me. She said, we, the Jewish people, have a Masorah that the person who passed away is begging in Shemayim for the family to find Nechama. It was such an important message for me because it almost turns the question around as much as it's an important question. Because it's like, the person who passed away, they want you to live a life normally. Now, of course, we know that there are certain time periods. We know that there is, even within the Shiva, like the first 3 days is the most intense, then there's the Shiva, and then there's the Shloshim in the first year. So we know, and that's obviously what we're meant to do. That's for sure. But at some point, a healthy situation, I mentioned the word healthy, it's important. I don't like to say it from a halakhic perspective, like there's a halakhic requirement to do this. It's a healthy situation. At some point, move on. And to move on, which doesn't mean you ever forget, it just means you now live your life without that part of your life that was so precious to you. You learned to adjust with that. So that's one thing. And I think, for me personally, amongst the most powerful of all the chapters in the book is the chapter on Nechama. It was a real eye-opener for me. So I'll tell you a fascinating point about the word Nechama. So the very first time, there's a certain concept that the first time a word is used in the Torah, that's its essential purpose, meaning. Although it's interesting because the one I mentioned before in Devarim is not the first time this term is used, but okay, even so. But here is the first place the word Nechama is used. It's at the end, I think it's believed at the end of Parshas Bereshis. It says Hashem was, he regretted having made the world, or maybe having made man. So what does it mean? And Rashi explains, Nechama is to reconsider something, to look at it from a different perspective. So that's what Nechama actually is. And I think it's maybe one of the sources it talks about, just like there's a mitzvah to give Nechama, there's also a mitzvah to receive Nechama. We have to realize Nechama, there's something divine about Nechama. It's not a natural thing. You lose your relative child, how can you ever go on? But the fact is, Hashem helps us to do that. So there's a certain, as we say at a Shiva, Hamakom Yanachem Eschem. Only God can really be the one to give you Nechama, but we try to help people to see that. So amongst the choices that people face is the choice of Nechama. There's a choice. Am I willing to go on, or I'm not prepared to go on? One of the most powerful points at the very end of that chapter, if you maybe you remember this is from many years ago, it's been David Hatuel. It's one of the most horrific things that happened in Gaza before we gave it back. We gave it to the Arabs. It was a terrible thing where his wife was driving with her four daughters, and were all murdered in such an awful situation. That was his entire life. His wife and all his children. Besides that, she was pregnant with a boy. Like from every side, it was the most horrific thing you could imagine. So he was asked afterwards, "Do you hate God?" And he said, "I'm only able to survive because of God." And then later on, at some point later on, he got engaged and got remarried. So the whole country was fascinated by the story. How can a person do such a thing? How is it possible to do that? So he said, I realized after this happened, I have two choices. I can just stop existing, or I can continue living my life. I'm choosing to live. I'm choosing life. That's what he said. And then someone was speaking about this and said, it's amazing when you realize people who went through the Holocaust, they lost even more than that. They lost their families, they lost their identities, they lost their communities, they lost everything. And now, of course, some people never lived a normal life after that, but there were definitely people who did live normal lives after that. So there's choice. There's a lot of choice involved. I have to say it very sensitively because I certainly don't want to pass judgment on anybody. I just spoke, I was being interviewed for a radio program in America, and the person asked me, would you say that someone who is not able to look at these things in a positive way must be lacking in bitachon or emunah? I said 100% not. It's a terrible, terrible thing to say such a thing. We have a concept in Judaism called onus rahmana patre. When you're forced by circumstances, you are exempt. People can be forced emotionally, and someone can be just broken, and no one can judge someone else, no one can evaluate someone else's pain or what they're going through. So, but there's still choice involved. There's choice involved, and people have to do their best to try to make the choice within the very challenging situation. So basically the answer to this question is, it's not in any way dishonoring the person. Once you go through the normal periods of time that Judaism speaks about, then you're willing to continue living your life. That's what the deceased wants. They want you to live a normal life. They don't want you to be in your entire life to be a broken person. So, okay, anyway, it's a very interesting, important point.
Just wondering, so touch on the idea of...
Can you speak a little louder?
Sorry. Just wondering about the idea of loss for a non-Jewish family relative. Do you discuss that at all? Like in terms of if there's a difference?
I don't discuss it specifically, but I don't see...
Or like what does the Torah say about does the neshama of a non-Jewish deceased relative also want you to have that nechama and have that same concept that you're...
The truth is, to be honest with you, I didn't see any source speaking about it. So I don't know. I don't see any reason why the principles wouldn't apply equally. It depends on how close a person was. Look, there are people who lose a close relative and they didn't have much of a good relationship in the first place with them. Then people who have an incredibly close relationship. I'm sure that's true whether the relative happens to be Jewish or non-Jewish. Sometimes you have an incredibly close relationship and then sometimes you have not such a good relationship with that person. So the psychological dynamics, the emotional dynamics, I think are the same. And I didn't see anyone speak about, any sources talk about that distinction. So I would assume there's not a distinction on an emotional level.
That's where I get confused. Like, is the neshama level...
I mean, look, maybe there's technical halakhic differences. Do you sit shiva, do you hear kriya? I don't know exactly the technical halakhic principles. But on an emotional level, I don't think it's different at all.
I would say the same God created them.
Yeah, I think it's all a question of your relationship. There are people who go through a shiva, and it doesn't bother them at all because they had a terrible relationship. It's very sad. And there are people who are broken. So I think it just depends on the person and the relationship with the person who passed away.
So you could apply that same statement about the person who's non-Jewish who passed away. Then
I don't see why not. I would assume so.
Receive it.
Yeah, I would assume so.
Have you seen any difference in terms of people's grieving when they have either an abbreviated shiva or shiva gets delayed due to being Chol Hamoed, things like that?
In terms of sources, I didn't see any sources talk about it, but it's obvious to me just the dynamic of it. That
So
I know.
dynamics. What have you seen in terms of difference, or you haven't really seen in terms of interviewing people?
It's only my own just perception. I mean, I'm generally in the book I try to only speak from Jewish sources, so I didn't see any sources discuss it. If you ask me personally, like I had my brother-in-law, his father passed away erev Pesach, this past Erev Pesach. So it was like such a crazy thing. It was just such a shock, and it was like no time to process anything, and everyone knows that Erev Pesach, like in the most ideal circumstances, and it was a crazy situation. So I'm sure the process of the Shiva continued for him.
The process of grief actually peaks about 6 months after the person has passed away.
Oh, interesting.
So, because at that beginning period, the person is kind of really in a protective state of shock.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time that wears off. And that's often, to realize that when people come in, that's often in the first year. And so and that by that time people might be saying, oh, why aren't you getting better? Because it doesn't really work that way. And it's important to realize that. So the Shiva kind of provides them with an opportunity to either grieve or sometimes the grief is just, I wish I'd had a better relationship with this person.
Mm-hmm.
Realizing it's grief is very complicated, but what you'll see is they will still need that time, and depending on the relationship, it can be a long time. One of the things that we do see is grief that's not resolved because there was no opportunity or permission to grieve, or they just were so overwhelmed with life they couldn't. And that is a problem because they need the time. So I always tell people to give themselves time and realize this process is very individual and does take time. It is not, there's nothing quick about it, and it can come and go throughout the person's life. And usually time makes it less intense than that, but still, a loss is a loss. So
It's not like in today's world
No.
where we're used to everything being fast. Some things you can't speed up.
you can't speed up the process of grief, and that's very important. But what we need to do with anybody we see is to encourage them to go through it. Because even if they say, oh, I didn't have such a close relationship, yeah, but somebody significant losing them means that's the grief.
And the grief is that it can never get any better.
Right. Can't get better, can't fix it. I mean, you can do certain things, but
Way.
yeah, but still, there's all sorts of things that grief.
And I'll say sometimes people have worse grief when they have bad relationships.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's like breaking up out of let's say, bad relationship. Even if the
right.
things sometimes takes a longer period to get over than when you have a really good relationship. All the memories are fond.
Yeah.
Because you don't have that to kind of cushion you, and then there's always well, now there's never a chance that you can ever repair it, make it better. I think of a client whose father walked out on her when she was 4, and she kind of is still grieving that relationship all her life, and looking, and every time I tell her that, she's like, why is it so important? This is our work for years. Only now is she beginning to say, that might not have been so easy for me. It's not such a simple thing that we experience. Sometimes it's stored in our bodies, we don't want to believe it, we go on with life, and then something happens and it hits us. It's not so simple.
By the way, one of the things I think is very important, I have a chapter in here on maintaining, sounds strange, maintaining a relationship
Yes,
with the
that's
people who
very-
passed away.
That's very important psychologically.
Right.
If you can do that, that's very helpful.
Right. So that's the whole concept of the Le'ilu Neshama. And it's an amazing concept that we can actually give to our deceased relative. I just finished, as I told you, I just finished
Right.
the 11 months from my mother on Shabbos. So it's a whole different situation for me now. I've been leading the davening for the last 11 months.
You told us that. That's
Yeah, so just an amazing thing, especially with a parent, because your parent, of course, you owe everything to your parent by definition. And the idea that I could be giving to my mother all these 11 months, every time I said Kaddish, every time I led the davening, it's an amazing, amazing feeling. It was a very big challenge. It was very hard for me, but it's an incredible opportunity. And you maintain a certain relationship. Like I tell people, there hasn't been one, and I say that the following statement with zero exaggeration. It's a literal statement. There hasn't been one day of the almost 20 years since my daughter passed away, I haven't thought about her multiple times. Not one day. What? There hasn't been one day in the almost 20 years since my daughter passed away that I haven't thought about her multiple times. That's a literal statement. And so there's a sense of a relationship.
And that ability to continue is comforting as well.
Very, very.
Very big comfort, and that's one of the things. So sometimes the work we can do is like, okay, this relationship wasn't good here, but you can still, sometimes there's a way to repair it, and the person will then, which is possible, let's say in our case somebody is mentally ill, a family member, how can we repair it over time, what can we do, and it's like, can be very, very powerful for the person, especially going through different periods of grief, things they might not have given themselves permission to do. So this is like, it's something that everybody experiences, why it's so important that we are able to cope with it and recognize it when it comes through the door.
Another thing is helping people to also grieve the parents they didn't have, or the kid they didn't have, or whatever it was. Like a lot of times with surplus reality, with psychodrama, we can do some of that. But just also they just need to acknowledge that that's part of their grief process. That they, the if onlys.
The if only. So this is all
part of their work.
That's such an important thing. And you never know what it's going to be. So how relationships touch us. These are things that we should realize. I always like to tell the story about how elephants grieve. Do you all know how elephants grieve? So elephants, a member of the elephant tribe, I don't know, group? No, there's a proper name for a group of elephants.
Google it.
Herd.
Like a herd?
Herd. A herd of elephants. Thank you. So you have a herd, and they're very connected, and a member dies. And they all stand around. Literally, they will not eat, they will not drink, and they put branches over the body of their dead, and you see the connection until something happens, and it can be a long time, days.
Days?
I thought it was 7 days. I read it was
It
actually
could be 7 days. It could be days until they finally somehow acknowledge the passing of their member of their herd, and they leave, which shows you that it is such a basic need us as human beings.
So interesting.
As mammals, we have a need. You can see it in the animal. Well, more so with us. They don't just go, "We're going back to work now." They don't do that, which is a problem in North America. Like, you should be over it in 2 days. They stand and wait. And
Is that the only animal that does that?
they have such a. It's such a
There
powerful
are other
rituals.
ones, but
I'm
yeah.
sure they are. There are, but
They're very social animals.
they're very social. They're very connected,
And they're very smart.
and they're smart.
Wow, so interesting.
And they're
Just
smart,
like
which
us.
is why our mascot is an elephant. But they're very connected, but they don't just say, well, she's got. They wait, and then it's like honoring her memory or his memory as part of the herd. And
So
that
interesting.
is it's really interesting, but it shows us anything you see in the animal world. No, it's a basic need we have.
It's also a Torah thing. They say that
Yeah.
anything that if we wouldn't have Torah, we would learn it from the animal world. So
Right, that's also interesting.
So we
Correct.
can't-
for elephants.
Right, we can't run from these things, and that's why it's important. And there's a big problem in North American society, especially where it's like, well, you went to the funeral, you're back to work tomorrow. There's no, this is something people don't have the chance. Like, you're just supposed to get up and how does that even work on the body in any way? So it's so important to know.
Right.
I had a lady who had a stillbirth, and COVID, and people trying to rush her to grieve. In the end, after a long talk, she decided she would give herself at the hospital time.
That's really true. In fact, stillbirths in the hospital give them place to stay with the baby and not just run, which is really,
They used to have not.
yeah.
One of the clients who referred me had that. She never
Oh,
had
yeah,
the
that's
place to go. There's no place, there's no way of tracking, tracing
That is something that if they do well, depends, I guess, on where you give birth or whatever, Here, I know, but different hospitals and different places.
Yeah.
Or you can ask.
I'm sure there's a range. I'm sure there's places that
People can
don't
also
help you that
ask,
much.
they don't always realize.
Of course, and they probably have a lot of resources.
No, like, and these are, it depends, but that feeling and all these things, and that's what we need, that time.
And I want to add one thing too, because doing some of the stuff they do at the ACI,
Yeah.
one of the things that I see that drives me crazy is people will go after 3 months, 6 months to a doctor and talk about being depressed, right? The doctor with antidepressants, and then 2 years later in my group, it's like I'm still. I don't know why why am I thinking? They get numbed and they never get through the grief. And I mean, I don't know if the doctors ask or whatever.
They didn't deal with it.
Of course.
Just covered it up.
It's like, I'm depressed. Well, you should be depressed. You lost your husband of 40 years. You never lived out of the house. You went right from there, and now you're like, you should. This is a hard transition. How do you, I mean, again, if people need antidepressants, I'm not saying
Well,
antidepressants.
unresolved grief, that's after a few years, sometimes you do, because then it's really stuck.
Correct.
But
But not after three months.
No,
6
then
months. I
we,
think it happens
even,
a lot.
yes, let's just drop, and then of course, then you're more likely to get the unresolved
That is
grief.
correct.
Unresolved grief, I mean, it depends who you ask. I usually think after 2 or 3 years. People need a while. But you can read, I think the DSM disagrees with me, but that's okay. 'Cause I
There is
think
something called unresolved grief.
Well, I
It
hold
is.
by you in the DSM.
There was,
Thanks. You clearly haven't met for a while. Okay.
I had a situation where I thought it was very strange, but this is what was experienced. A woman, single, that went through a very hard process of a mother dying. Very, very two connected family. The family very much connected with each other. But she was the one who was taking care of the mother as she was dying. She was the youngest one and she was at home. And then finally the mother did die and everybody was grieving and they said, "You're not okay, you're not grieving, you need to go for therapy." She came in for therapy and we talked this way, that way, the other way, up, down. It turned out that she got married after that. After the mother died, so she was into a new relationship, and father very soon got remarried. But she said, I was the one who was getting ready for the eventuality because I was
She
taking
had more
care of
time
my
to
mother.
prepare.
I was living through it, and I was living through the torture every time I saw my mother fetch or couldn't eat, or I lived through that with her. So when she finally died, I was ready for it. I'm wondering if
Well, that's
some relief.
That's
Some
interesting.
level of relief as well.
Yeah.
Also,
Get
there's a process that maybe she was going through all along, and she, there is that grief is personal. So she could have been grieving each step, which means at the end, it could be that feeling of, she's no longer in that pain. But if you didn't follow the process, it might hit you actually harder, or it might hit her further along. You don't really know. Or she might really be okay.
Are you saying that
She might have gotten married again so she could take care of somebody else.
It could be too. We don't really know. We don't really
I
know.
don't know.
Yeah, you
Right.
don't
People
know.
that can't are scared to enter a relationship. Feel
Right,
lost.
right, there can be that as well. We don't know. What we do know is we shouldn't force someone, because somebody could come in 20 years later and say, I don't get it, why am I so upset? And we could trace it back to that. We don't know. The psyche will protect us, so we don't really know.
It's interesting, actually. Shortly after our daughter passed away, so she was the oldest, and she was 14. So then our other kids were very young, relatively speaking, and so pretty early on, my wife and I were feeling like, well, maybe we should give them counselors or something. I don't know, like, should we DS or not? I don't know. So I spoke to someone, and he said a very simple thing. He said, if they ask, you should make it clear to them that it's available. If they want it, then you'll definitely make it available to them. But if they don't feel that they need it or they are asking for it, don't force it on them. That's for sure not. He said people are much more resilient than we think. And he says, think about what happened all throughout history. Most people had very, very hard situations, and people that we have the kalim to deal with a lot more than we think we can. Someone once told me, I heard this once at a shiva. He said, what people today call problems, people used to call life.
Yeah.
Right? So, but it was interesting, and the truth, in the end, none of our kids ever asked for counselors. We didn't make it clear to them we would be happy to get them one, and they didn't ask for it, and they all dealt with it in their own way. And
We don't really know.
I'm sure you gave them a lot of support along the way.
yeah, we tried to. We certainly tried to, but that's the point, is that you can't put people in boxes and like this is what
Also
everyone has to
grieve
do.
differently. Children grieve much differently than adults, so we don't know. And also like,
Depending on their ages.
and also depends like, sometimes it could be, you won't see it until like they get married and they might have a child the same age, and then something could, you don't really know. And some people really are, they do manage, and they really are like, they grieve. But what I'm saying is it's a process that has to happen some way. So children don't grieve as adults, but they will grieve. But it's a process that we have to let happen, which means we talk about the person. That's what we
That's
say.
a very important thing.
We don't-
My wife and I always felt.
Talk about the
We
person.
talk about her. We don't. It's not
Don't
like
sweep it under the
not like
rug.
you can't say her name.
We don't, that's really where people get stuck. We don't say, we're not talking about so-and-so because we're worried it's gonna hurt you, but you're already hurt. Like, we talk about it. We discuss it. Then the person doesn't just mysteriously disappear. Somebody said that she's still stuck at 3 years old when her grandfather passed away suddenly. And right around her birthday, like she couldn't have her birthday party, she remembered she was 3. Because her grandfather had passed away and nobody talked about it. And our whole work was going back to the 3-year-old part and giving it a chance to talk about it and what happened to, and she felt like it was amazing how much was stuck there in her whole view of the world just because nobody talked about it. She said if somebody had just talked about it, she would have been okay. We just don't talk. Not a good idea.
Part of it with children is also how the parents react to it.
Yeah.
Because if the child not only loses the grandparent or a sibling, but they
And
also
then
lose the
lose
mother.
parent. The parent gets depressed. She said that mom got depressed, and that was, so then parents aren't available. There's too much, the child is just, it's too much.
Suicide, we see that a lot. Like nobody talks about it.
Nobody talks
and
about
I
it.
think it's.
Aneurysm.
Well,
Aneurysm.
right.
Oh.
Or fell down the stairs. But I'm saying
That's what people will
today
say?
with-
Yeah, aneurysm is one of the key words that.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
We talk about, yes.
But I think with children, especially if they have a brother or sister that commits, or mother or father, it's like people don't want to go for a lot of different reasons, especially from the community because of the stigma that's on it. But we used to actually make those things got to be talked about. And when we see families, we got to tell them like this is not something you got to talk about.
It's not healthy.
No, hell no.
That's why Disney made a new movie, and their best song is "We Don't Talk About Bruno." Why?
Everybody loves that song.
Why? Let's just sweep it under the
We don't
carpet.
talk about Bruno.
We don't talk
And
about
they sing
Bruno.
that for like 6 minutes straight.
Yes,
Different
and it's a
varieties.
great
We
because
don't talk
that
about
movie's all about family relations. Good for you,
Bruno.
Disney.
We don't talk about
What was the movie then?
What?
What movie is that?
It's in
Encanto.
Encanto. It's a new Disney film, and it's really all about family relations. It's really, but they really do a great job with this song. And it's very, why? We don't talk about it. We just don't talk about that guy, the one who's like the outlier, this one, that, he's a character. But it's great because it captures this talk. And in such a great way because it's, but that's the, that's the idea. Why, what stops people from talking about it? It hurts. We don't want to face it. There's guilt, there's shame, there's all this stuff around. Denial.
There's also a religious aspect when it comes to suicide. The thought of
Well, yeah, Bruno doesn't kill himself.
Yeah,
He's
okay,
just kind of like the kid off the dare.
Yeah.
But he still disappeared. Like nobody knows if he's alive or dead until you see what happens, which is it has a nice ending. It's just, but it doesn't matter because it gives you the idea what happens when we don't talk. And what really happens when we don't talk in the movie is the whole family just crashes. The foundation of the family eventually falls apart.
Literally.
Literally. So it's showing why it's important that we talk, which is why we talk about the elephant in the room.
Can I ask about, this is something we discussed that I don't know about, like the idea of talking about something, talking about somebody who's nifter, like this comes up a lot, some people say, I don't know, I'm just asking, is there a Torah basis to saying we should not speak about someone who's nifter in a critical way. Besides in our own personal therapy, like, you know, for example, we have this, you know, come up with the Heimwalder case after a certain time. People would say like, oh, like, you can't talk about him after, you know, passed away. Like, you can't judge him after he passes away. You don't criticize someone after this. Like, is there a value? Is there a Torah basis to that, or is that?
Well,
is that
I
not
think for
true?
sure not there. I can't imagine how anyone could say that.
People, you would be amazed what people
Says
say.
that.
I guess I would be.
Yeah.
We can't speak Lashon Hara about the dead.
No, okay.
After doing something else,
No. So
there's
yeah,
no
okay.
basis in-
Look, I think the simple answer is Hilchos Shmurta Lashon talks about the fact you don't speak negatively unless it's a Torellis. That's the simple halacha. So in that particular case, if there's a Torellis to talk about it because it's so important, people be protected from these kinds of horrible things. But obviously, a petty thing about someone passed away, like what's the point of that? Why don't talk about that? So I would imagine it's exactly the same rules as normally with Lashon Hara. If there's a strong Torellis with different rules and conditions, you do. Otherwise, you don't.
Okay, so there's nothing about the person not being able to defend himself after a certain point. That's not a relevant factor.
Again, I didn't see sources about this, but it's just common sense to me. I don't see why it should be any different than with normal rules of Lashon Hara. If there's a strong Torellis, normally we don't. Obviously, it's not a healthy thing to say negative things about people in general. But if there's a strong Torellis, then you do. If there's not a strong Torellis, then you don't. I don't see that's why, like a magical thing, if he passed away, then that changes the whole equation. I don't think so.
I think the Chaim said the Cher Makadmoinim not to speak Lashon Hara about dead people.
Well, that's Lashon Hara. That's where there's no Torellis.
Yeah, but it's not the classic Lashon Hara. It's the Cher Makadmoinim.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
bit different.
And,
Okay.
But in spiritual, it says if it's going to help somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
listen to it.
Yeah.
The question
Right.
is, what's
We're gonna
the
learn
for us? Is
Obviously.
what's the therapeutic reason?
Right.
Yeah, because there's a, yeah.
Okay. I want to mention one more thing in the book. One thing that I found very, very a bit of surprise and extremely refreshing was in the chapter which is about dealing with anger at God and called difficult emotions. It was remarkable to me just how what the right word is, how flexible, how understanding, how compassionate the Torah perspective actually is, much more than I think people expect. There's a feeling of you just can't ever express anger. You just can't do that. And it's horrible if you do that. And there's an understanding from Torah sources. In fact, the Gemara says explicitly that, and we learn this from Eov, that if someone even God forbid, blasphemes and lashes out, which is clearly a wrong thing to do, there's no onus for that, if it's coming from the pain of the Yisurim. And that's such an important thing to know about, because people can otherwise get into a very, very dangerous spiral, where something happens, and then they're angry, and then they get petrified, that, now I'm really in trouble, but then they get resentful, and it's just a terrible spiral. And it's just not true,
God
Like-
has very big shoulders.
Yeah, right. And one of the most powerful sources, which I quote a number of times in the book, is from the Eish Kodesh. And it's amazing. The Eish Kodesh is the collected writings of what the Piazetzner Rebbe said to his Hasidim in the Warsaw Ghetto. As their entire world is collapsing around them, he's speaking every Shabbos and encouraging them and trying to help them deal with the horrific situations they're in. And he wrote down shorthand notes of what he said and buried them. And he was never murdered in the Holocaust. And I think in the 1950s, someone discovered the buried notes and published it. And it's amazing.
Great-grandson lives in a farm off of the Mediterranean.
I'm sorry, what?
Thank you.
His great-grandson lives in a village off of the Mediterranean.
Oh, okay.
Friedman.
Oh, okay.
Wow, thanks, Chagit.
Yeah, we actually have the Piazetzner Rebbe, the current one, in our neighborhood in Ramat Beit Shemesh. He has a shul. He's in a shul called Eish Kodesh. He's the nephew. I think he's the great nephew of the one who passed away and was murdered in the Holocaust. Anyway, the point is that human beings have many emotions, and people are allowed and able to express emotions. And it's healthy and it's normal to express emotions. And for someone to feel, and I think many people do feel, you're not allowed to feel that way. You're not allowed to express that, and you'll be in big trouble if you do. And I think it's a particularly important chapter because you see, and again, it's not anyone saying it, me saying it, it's classical sources saying it. And it's very refreshing to see that.
So,
This is, oh, I'm sorry.
no.
It's funny to me actually how much I see people say, well, you know, you have to have a muna,
Right.
you shouldn't feel these feelings, etc. But all you have to do is look at Tehillim. It's filled with complaints. David HaMelech is complaining all the time.
Real
He's saying
emotional.
how hard it is. It's not like he's, no one's telling David HaMelech, you shouldn't have these emotions because you don't have enough muna. What, you're better than David HaMelech? I mean, it's the whole Tehillim you see it. It's shocking to me that people say that, like, I guess you're more thrown than David HaMelech.
I think people are taught certain things, and that doesn't. It's in school because they're trying to teach certain things. But what happens when real life hits? That, like, I'm thinking of a young girl came out of the Beis Yaakov system, and she goes, she's really angry, but she's not allowed to be. This causes an inner conflict. Because when you're in school, they're trying to, teach you certain things, and they're not always going to tell you about all these emotions, because they're teaching a class of how many people. So, you have to kind of accept things. This is what they're going to teach people. But I don't know if it's always taught about individuals. Like,
I think not. The answer is not.
I do not believe so, and that's a problem when people are very, sensitive or faced with real things, and they can feel guilty for being angry and this and that.
Right.
And they come into therapy, and then you have to try to kind of almost deprogram them, and it's a little tricky.
It's improper.
So it's very refreshing and very very healthy to see the proper Torah perspective. Very validating to see that.
Yes, but when you go to school, there's certain things they're trying to teach a big group of people.
I can't tell you how many people come in, religious people, and I ask them, like, when they talk about the things that are happening, and they say, it's not like you're angry with God. And,
Yeah.
And I said, have you ever told them? And they go, how can I tell God? How can I be angry with God? And I mean, it's not just once you're.
No, I hear it all the time.
No, for sure.
We talk about that, and it's an important thing.
That's why I'm mentioning it.
That's having a real relationship with God.
That's what I tell them.
That's what I was going to say.
Exactly.
That's what we're here for. We're not just here to be these perfect little Amuna Bubala.
But it's
Right.
hard.
But that's what people are told.
Because what
That's
go
not Yiddishkeit.
Isn't that-
No, it's
It's not real.
I understand what you're saying, but that's what people are told.
You're right.
We as therapists know that. but
Yeah,
we
yeah.
don't.
And there's a reason, because they're going to school, and when you go to school, you're teaching a group of people, and it's,
I don't know if that's.
This needs to be discussed with educators because I really believe a lot of the rebellion and a lot of the
we're going to go off to a different topic now, which is very important, but
We
I would
always
like
go
to, yes, but in the interest of where we are.
But I just want to mention that there's
Yes.
if you want to see sources on that, there's here.
Yes, and I know there are.
Very
But I just want to know, because Rabbi Resnick came, and really, we have the book, and I want anybody, if you have any questions specifically on the topic of grief, specifically, we can go off on a tangent about anything, but specifically about this topic, specifically of how you think, any questions about how can this be useful to my clients, or if you have any, anything like that, this is a moment for you to share this. Rabbi Resnick very nicely came with his time, and I was very excited, and when we planned this date, he told me about his mother's yard site, so I felt like, wow. And here we all are meeting back face to face, and seeing and helping continue this week with your mother's full name.
She didn't really have a Hebrew name, so I say Beverly Faith Bas Rav Asher.
Beverly Faith Bas Asher should really, get her neshama should get an aliyah from all of this work, and us just meeting so close after the yard site is not just a coincidence, because it took us a while to find this date. So, see.
Right.
But if anybody has anything specific in this area, because we're going to finish up, and I'm hoping we can give Sharnay the floor to give a little case presentation, that would be amazing. If anybody has anything specific in this area, this is your time. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, so I've heard different opinions on this. When it comes to the a family who's lost a child, the divorce rates, or how that affects the relationship between husband and wife, and what could be done to reinforce the marriage? First of all, is that just a trigger that, how do I phrase this? Is the statistics higher, but this is normal, but this is just a trigger, or is it actually higher among such families?
So I'll tell you the truth. I don't know really. I was told that there's a very high incidence of divorce. I was told that I forget the exact number. It was a very high number.
It's significance with the
Yeah.
correlation.
So but I never saw like a real proper statistics about it.
So,
But we were nervous about that. Like, when I heard it, and I was like, wow, it was a scary number.
so what would you suggest, either as a clinician or even just a friend that's knowing somebody goes through it, to how one can?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you when I heard that, when I heard there's a very high incidence, whatever that number happens to be, I said to myself, I have to really work proactively on my relationship with my wife. Don't just say, well, we're focusing on a situation with our daughter, as much as we need to do that, but this is an opportunity to really work on my relationship with my wife more. I mean, the truth is, for us, it was a whole dynamic, because my wife was, like I said, literally for months at a time in the hospital. So after my daughter's patira, we were kind of back together as a family. So it was a sort of a strange dynamic to finally have that in the midst of the grief, to actually have the family back together again for the first time in about 3 years.
Wow.
Which is a very, very, massive family trauma. But I think the short answer to your question is it's a real chance to work on the relationship with your family, with your spouse. Because again, I don't, like I said, I heard a huge. I didn't know.
Fact check?
What?
Can I fact check? So it's a myth, and it arrives from an article by Therese Rando in 1985, and subsequent research dispels the myth.
Wow. That's not a higher number?
No, I think she cites 90% without any research support.
Well, that for
to
sure
it.
can't be true.
Wow. 90% of what?
In peer-reviewed
Get
studies,
divorced?
That can't possibly be.
I heard 75%.
in peer-reviewed studies, it's not true. There's no correlation to divorce.
I think
It could be a
Okay.
myth. That was one of the things that's
That's right,
around.
crazy.
Well, I can tell you what was
That
good.
studies, volume 22, if you're interested, peer-reviewed.
So what?
research.
The
No
positive.
They because it's a number seven.
If anything,
Bad relationship.
if anything, there's a correlation to strengthening the relationship. The very positive one.
If it's
Just
used
like
right.
any
Sickness.
type of
Sickness.
But I can say the good thing was, despite the fact that's not true,
That's nice.
it did give me a strong incentive to work on my relationship. So that was
It's never
good.
bad.
What?
Yeah. It does sometimes if there's a blame, like somebody's driving the car and that kind of thing.
Oh, that would be so awful.
Oh.
That
And
does
that happens
happen.
sometimes.
That does happening, and then what do you do? Those kind of things. Right, but again, it just like any other crisis, it can highlight weaknesses or challenges in the relationship that hopefully you can, use it as an opportunity to work through.
I
Right.
also that sometimes I assume that people mourn differently.
Yes, that's also
Mourn
very
differently.
important.
That's very important.
And it can infuriate one and the other.
If the one is more
You're
this or
cold,
that.
you're sensitive.
So understanding it's a very individual process, but the idea that the person or especially a child is always with a person is very, very important. And I will say, like, sudden death is the most difficult, it's the most stressful on the human body because you're not prepared. So if, somebody is sick, your body gets time to get used to and you're not, they kind of begin to get prepared. So the shock on the body isn't as great. But if it's sudden, the body goes into a state of shock, and that is more difficult. And there's a lot of research on that.
I believe that.
I
The
want to
differences.
add something. Grief that's too. Grief doesn't always have to be to death.
No,
It can be,
that's what
it
we
can be
started
women
saying.
getting over an age where they're not going to have
Yes.
children.
Could be so
People,
many
singles getting to an age where they realize they're probably not going to get married. Like it hits and you have hope and you have a moon, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden you hit an age, whatever that age is,
Right.
and there is a grief that goes in that life. And I think we have,
Disability, I'm seeing.
Yeah.
the disability,
We talked about
obviously
also
we see that
loss.
it's a little easier to see if somebody loses a leg and becomes disabled to understand that. But people going through certain stages of their lives also
Yes.
hit points of grief that they have to have a process.
And that's something we said because we come into the world with a life script, and that doesn't always happen.
Right.
So understanding that,
So I would add to that, and therefore, nechama is relevant to all these situations.
yes.
And particularly that idea I mentioned, that looking at things from a different perspective is so important from all these things.
Victor Frankl's so important.
Victor,
Oh,
yes,
that's-
Victor
When they're using book batteries.
Yes, which,
Yeah.
if there's a meaning for something, it definitely helps. But I'm just gonna ask for a couple more questions
Well, I
before
just
we
wanted
say
to ask-
goodbye.
Because you started saying about the Ish Kodesh, and I didn't know if you got that out yet, or if you said it already.
I was mentioning in terms, and I was mentioning in the context of painful emotions, because he is very strong and honest about his feelings.
Ah, okay.
And he shows his Hasidim how one can do that.
Okay.
His emunah is incredibly strong and is a strong relationship, and therefore he's able to express very strong emotions. And sometimes you see what he says, and you're a little bit surprised. This massive Hasidic Rebbe to say that, but okay, it was a normal relationship, and he was going through incredible difficulties, and that gives us a feeling that. So I'm also allowed to say things. I'm also allowed to express my feelings.
There was the thing that I brought up to a couple of Vandadim as a child is that when Yaakov could not have Nechama after not seeing his son for 22 years, I think?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes.
And so from there I understood that there's in our DNA there's a certain mechanism that Hashem put in us, that the Nechama is there after a year or 2 or 3 and so on. And that kind of helped to console the couple that yes, it's hard now, but after a certain time, there's the Nechama come in because Hashem has put it in
Right.
our DNA.
I did feel after the first 12 months, there was a certain. I did feel after the first 12 months, there was a certain degree of the intensity was diminished.
Yes.
Right.
I'm not, Chas v'shalom, I'm not trying to diminish what you're going through, and of course, everybody has his own process, but there's something greater than us that we don't understand that does come in and does help the
Right.
loss.
I think that understanding that grief is a process, as long as we let it go through us, our bodies, or we're allowed to talk, people can talk about it, that is the process that we all have naturally, including the elephants. And I think that's why. And if we stop it because we have our minds, which animals don't, then we say, oh, I shouldn't be, then we stop the process and we get into trouble, rather than just saying, hey, this is gonna happen and it's okay, and maybe it'll hit me, every so often, and that's okay, that's just part of what it means to be human.
Right. Oh, so I'm going to mention there was a person who told me that they were going to they would give me some to donate different books to different situations that would be helpful. So this is the first 3 books that I'm doing in that way. It's a particular family that actually play the Howlers, hear them?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is so I'm leaving 3 books here.
Thank you.
So these are books or resources for the center, and obviously I guess you decide how you want to do it. Maybe you want to lend 1 out or whatever you want, how you want to deal with it. So I'm leaving 3 here, and this way you haven't have to go through. I'm happy to if you want to get your own personal copy. Obviously, I'm happy to do that. I also want to mention, like I said, my website, jewishclarity.com, is I think a very important resource, and all the chapters here come from articles on the website. And I'll also mention my email is aresnick@h.com. So ARESNICK. I happen to be in a very, very busy time right now because my daughter's yard site is just under a month from now. So this is a super intense time for me. So right now I probably won't be as responsive as other times. But once I get past that, then I'm happy to, if you want to give me a phone call or discuss a particular case or ask a question, I'm happy either by email or by phone. I'm happy to be a resource.